My name is Eric Pagley. I'm the host of the Polar Geopolitics Podcast and co-arranging this three-part session along with the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and the Arctic Frontiers Conference. And in this third session here, we're going to be talking about the future of the Arctic Council, particularly from a perspective of scientific cooperation in environmental issues and governance. And joining me for this, we have Dr. Volker Rachold, head of the German Arctic office at the Alfred Wegener Institute, and Dr. Elana Wilson Rowe, research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Thank you both for joining here on this session, and we'll try to save some time at the end for a few questions, so keep that in mind. But Elana, we can start with you. Perhaps before we speak specifically about the future of the Arctic Council, what in your estimation are some of the broader global and regional trends that are putting Arctic governance and cooperation under increasing pressure?
Thanks for the question. Thank you for the invitation to join this podcast. And I think it's a good question because we often think about the Arctic Council kind of on its own. I think all of our earlier podcast speakers also addressed the fact that it's under pressures and drivers from outside as well. And I think there are three things that we're used to thinking about and maybe three things we're not so used to thinking about. And of course, we know that one of the pressures on Arctic governance relates to kind of security or risk of conflict, rivalry dynamics in the region itself. You know, could misunderstandings or tactical level accidents escalate the presence of hybrid threats and so on. We also know, of course, and we had a long, great discussion about this earlier, is the impact of Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine on just the dynamics and range of possibility for cooperation with all Arctic states in the Arctic Council, while at the same time, given the project profile of a lot of the Council, a lot of projects can continue even without Russian cooperation. And then, of course, I'm sure my colleague here will talk a lot about this, is of the climate change that's just going to be transforming and is transforming the region. But I think there's some quieter and trends and aspects that aren't necessarily kind of newspaper headlines. Like everyone else, I also am always checking before this, what's happened, what's new. There's a lot that's changing. But at the same time, there's these kind of broader issues that are shaping the terrain for Arctic cooperation and cooperation in general. I mean, the first is that we have this kind of deglobalizing world. You know, the global political era in which like economic relations and political relations are becoming more closely intertwined, and so you hear things about the ideas of friendshoring or de-risking supply chains, and there are signs that it's becoming this macroeconomic reality, that there's a reflection of politically allied relationships. So kind of restructuring the global economy along these geopolitical lines of amity and enmity. And this, of course, can kind of have unexpected outcomes for the Arctic. It could be resources that are not maybe that, like critical minerals that maybe are not that attractive in a purely market perspective, could become more important with this strategic thinking about the economy. And so that also creates a heightened pressure and a heightened importance for the region. I'll come back to the economy. At the same time, I think there can be some vast overestimations about how quickly things will happen. They may happen elsewhere in the world instead. Second factor is, of course, on the same lines that multilateralism is under pressure. Like, I think we see this especially in kind of other bodies, not different than the Arctic Council, that maybe deal with economic issues like the World Trade Organization. And we also have seen the growth of kind of alternative constellations, the idea of like the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and friends, maybe kind of pushing on a multilateral order that they think is built to serve the states primarily that founded it or Western interests alone. And at the same time, you know, we talked earlier today about Greenland and Trump, that there might be global governance is also a way of exerting power, but it's very quiet power and slow power. And I think there's a kind of a growing attention to the idea of direct power, getting what you want. And I think Trump's the idea of making deals and so on, like we've seen kind of, and pressuring to get a better deal like we've seen around Greenland, is also a tactic, of course, that undermines the notion that we work through multilateral bodies. We work to realize own interests collectively when those interests are shared. So, and then finally, just before I kind of round off on this point, is that a third kind of, I think, trend we don't realize, it's actually kind of pushing in the direction of more Arctic cooperation, is the fact that with these problems at the global level, there's a real emphasis on regional cooperation. You know, already in environmental agreements, it's something like 60% of all international agreements are not fully global. They're regional, maybe bilateral or trilateral. So a lot of the governance we have is not global, but kind of anchored elsewhere. And one point I'd like to share from my research before we move on is that I think a really important output of Arctic cooperation, it's of course all the numerous like recommendations and agreements and things that get put into the world, but it also creates a sense of order. Who is supposed to be leading or helping or in what capacity on Arctic affairs? And I think that a functioning and vibrant Arctic Council for a long time, with all the physical changes in the region, kind of sent a signal to the rest of the world that the Arctic states were working together. And then I think when cooperation with Russia ceased, due to the invasion of Ukraine, that the Arctic Seven, coordinating their narrative and working together, did a lot for that. So it was, I think, I really saw that as possibly kind of one of the quite damaging outcomes of whatever happens between the Trump and Greenland flirt or enduring interest or leading to a deal, that it does kind of unsettle this ordering effect. And I think that that's something that we need to consider and think of. How will the sense of order around the Arctic change in the time to come?
And Volker, in some ways you represent perhaps a link to actors outside of the region, right? Being from Germany, one of the Arctic Council observer states. So based on what Elana has just outlined there, what do you see as the role of the observers in the Arctic Council, both in terms of scientific cooperation, but also maybe as a way for the Arctic Council to reach a much broader global set of stakeholders?
I think first of all, I think the main interest that I would say most of the observers have in the Arctic Council comes from scientific work. I mean, if you take my country, Germany has a long tradition and long history of doing Arctic research. And of course, even in terms of the funding, I think Germany puts much more money into Arctic research than several of the Arctic states, simply because our economy is bigger. And that, of course, is the main driver of our interest. In terms of what's happening on the Arctic Council, especially looking back at the last 2 years, the observers were not really very much involved, obviously. So the decision to pause the Arctic Council after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine was something that was taken by the Arctic states. And the observers were, from time to time, informed about what's going on. So, but of course, still, the Arctic Council also very much relies on the scientific expertise of the observers. So, and most of the observer countries are really interested in getting their experts and getting their knowledge to the Arctic Council via the working groups. And basically, if you look at the Arctic Council, how it is today, I mean, Norway achieved a lot over the last 2 years, making the Arctic Council working again, at least at the working group level, and that actually is the scientific part of the Arctic Council. So if you take it like that, I mean, what's above the senior officials levels and ministerial level is, of course, the political part of the Arctic Council. But the scientific work is happening in the working groups, and there, of course, the observers play an important role, and contribute their expertise. I wonder how it will evolve in the future. I mean, we had mentioned already two threats. First, of course, the issue with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and that most of the countries, or let's say all of the countries on the Arctic Council, are not cooperating with Russia anymore, at least for the time being. So the German Arctic policy guidelines just published last year, they also said that Russia is not considered a partner in Arctic research for the time being. And that, of course, the question is, how can the Arctic Council continue that, only working on the scientific level, and can observers play a more stronger role in the Arctic Council? The next thing, of course, that you also mentioned, and that's, I think, in my view, it's also a really important issue that we have to face, is what happens with the new US administration and US leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. What does that mean for the Arctic Council? Because the foundation of the Arctic Council is, of course, environmental protection. That's how the Council was established back in the 90s with the idea of having a body for the Arctic states to talk about the protection of the Arctic. The second issue, sustainable development, came in later, actually. So, and then from the very beginning on, the Arctic Council decided to focus only on these two things and leave other things, let's say, outside of the mandate of the Arctic Council. So now, of course, we have to see what happens, seeing the new US policy in terms of going back to fossil fuels and kind of ignoring climate change by leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. What does it mean for the Arctic Council? This is a challenge, of course. So there are actually two challenges. And then the third one is probably also, there's certainly more also economic interest in the Arctic. Yeah? And that's not only from the Arctic states, but it's also coming from external states, which are partly also observer on the Arctic Council. So it's a delicate thing and delicate future, and really hard to foresee how that will develop over the next couple of years, I think. Yeah.
I could ask, I mean, the German Arctic Office, I mean, you're in some ways a node for a lot of these different types of stakeholders, the scientific stakeholders, the economic stakeholders, political stakeholders. How compatible are these different visions for the Arctic? Are there any contradictions between these different views of how the Arctic Council should develop over time?
Yeah, of course there are different views. I mean, if you talk to a scientist or to a diplomat, of course they have different ideas. So my office sits actually more on the scientific part. We are part of the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research, but we work very closely with the Foreign Office, which in Germany represents the country on the Arctic Council. So we provide scientific advice. We have to find the right experts for the various working groups of the Arctic Council. So that's kind of my job. So we are very closely connected, but sitting in between actually. I personally have a long history with the Arctic Council, because before I was Executive Secretary of International Arctic Science Committee for 10 years. So I've worked with the Arctic Council since 20 years now, something like that.
Can I jump in on that
Absolutely.
last question as well? But I think also in extension of that, one of the tensions that we've seen, before kind of the reinvasion of Ukraine and the cessation of cooperation, attention politically, of course, was on the spectrum between conservation and use in sort of a broad sense. Like on a more granular level, there might be agreement about this area could be protected and not. But I think there's a difference also in how, for example, how much the Arctic areas are already a part of a national economy, say for Norway or Russia versus some of the other countries in the Arctic Council. And then also a thing that will, I think, continue to change, it's entirely unique about the Arctic Council, is also the presence of Indigenous peoples organizations participating as permanent participants. And we already see some interesting signs like the Pikiala-Sorsvak Commission not between Greenland and Canada, but between Inuit communities on both sides of this large marine area, seeking to develop sort of a shared mechanism for management and free travel and so on. It faces a lot of challenges. But I also think the future of how the Arctic Council works will be continue as long as there's not, we see a lot of kind of populist backlash against kind of more progressive policies as well, but it is a kind of a decisive trend of decolonization that I think will continue to shape how Arctic politics works and should do so.
I mean, in one of the earlier sessions today, we talked quite a bit about science diplomacy. This is something that, Volker, I think you're quite interested in yourself as well. Being a scientist, as you mentioned, head of IASC previously, and being the head of the German Arctic Office as well. What would you say are the foundations in terms of the work of science diplomacy related to some of these broader challenges that Elana has talked about before?
I mean, first, I think we should really keep in mind what science diplomacy actually means. So it's much broader than just helping diplomatic relationship. Everything where science feeds into policy making, that is considered science diplomacy. So basically, if you define my job, I'm only doing science diplomacy. So 100% of my job is science diplomacy. So it's a pretty broad definition of what science diplomacy means. So what people always think when they hear that is that scientific cooperation and scientific relationship can solve diplomatic problems. That can work partly. I mean, there are fantastic examples on that. So the best one that is always used is, of course, the International Geophysical Year 57-58, which was in the middle of the Cold War, where scientific cooperation at the end resulted in the establishment of the Antarctic Treaty. So that was signed just 2 years after this International Geophysical Year, and that's why there's lots of discussion here at this conference as well about the next International Polar Year, 2032 to 33, as kind of the solution to all the problems we have. I think that's a bit too much expected from this. Of course, scientific cooperation can help also states to improve their diplomatic relationship, but it always requires some kind of political will and political support to have this cooperation. So, and yeah, we will see what happens, because I mean, especially in the situation with the cooperation with Russia, which is interrupted for many countries, science diplomacy does not work if there is no relationship, and if it's only a, let's say, person-to-person dialogue between individual scientists. That's a bit of an issue. Yeah.
Now, Elana, how can Arctic diplomacy and governance be made more resilient? I mean, given all these challenges and some of these future priorities coming up, despite all these geopolitical upheavals that were taking place right now?
I think that's a really important question, and also just building on your example, Volker, of the Antarctic Treaty that was about science diplomacy, but it was also about a political will that, you know, the broader kind of geopolitical framework around diplomacy really does matter. And I think thinking about resilience is important, because in the previous sessions also talking, you know, the Arctic Council is surviving, it's making it, but it's an important set of reflections, because out of international organizations, we know that not all do. There's a really great study by Mette Eilstrup San Giovanni at the University of Cambridge, who found that in the past 200 years, we've had 561 international organizations, and 218 have ceased to exist. And like the reasons they don't exist today is because external shocks or internal disagreement. But at the same time, and they can be replaced, they can kind of fade away, they can merge with other bodies. While I think encouraging in the Arctic situation is that organizations with more technical mandates that are delivering knowledge or services or that serve a practical need, like the scientific cooperation that tells us what is going on with the Arctic, essential to international governance and also national decision making, tend to make it, and they're needed in times of crisis. And also, you know, with an eye towards the future, it makes us think that we need to think about what are ways of ensuring the continued relevance, the continued ability to deliver on Arctic outcomes, some within the Arctic Council, maybe some more broadly. And so when I think about like the diplomacy for this period is really more a process of finding opportunities to do work that's kind of relevant and defensible and useful, and kind of muddling through. And it also reminds me, there's an Ibsen quote that I really like, that you can't put your best trousers on when you go out fighting for truth and justice. Like, it's messy. And I think you could say the same for Arctic politics today. We've had a period where, you know, there was kind of something, it could be easily celebrated. It had this heightened political importance. Ministers would come. There were great photo ops, you know, and now it's less so. It's back to kind of the core work, and some of it's very difficult. And just like briefly, just 3 quick ideas on things that can be done, and I think these are things that are pretty much already happening. So it's, you know, of course, the heightened global profile, the ability to use both kind of Arctic Council knowledge and actors in international settings. And we've seen it in the past with like the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, or the Arctic leading to, you know, into the UNFCCC, or the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment leading into the Polar Code, and so on. And I think we see it now happening. This chairship has had some really interesting activities on cryosphere cooperation in the UNFCCC, and also on, for example, like marine litter or plastic pollution matter as well. And as many have already said, like, this is an expensive proposition, that supporting this type of diplomacy when it's maybe not kind of an easy or more straightforward one-stop shop where everyone's gathered in a political conversation is very time-consuming. So funding for both permanent participants, actors, and a very robust diplomacy, I think, should be a priority of all the Arctic states. Those networks are important, and they're not cheap, I think, is the message there. And then I would say, and I also heard this earlier today, that working in a different way, I think we should also extract from the experience of the past decades, you know, what is the Arctic way of working? What is important? And I think you hear throughout a commitment to inclusivity of rights holders, indigenous peoples, and also this idea of knowledge-based policymaking, that there is this science policy interaction that are sort of core principles of Arctic cooperation. And finally, I've said this many times, and it's a very easy point, that I think there could be a huge increase in how well implemented a lot of the science-based, knowledge-based recommendations that have already been made in the Arctic Council or elsewhere. And then I think in the lack of, there's also a risk that, you know, in the absence of, it's not a time where a political conversation is really possible in the Arctic Council. And of course that could result in tapering ambitions and in terms of what are new areas of cooperation and so on. So I really hope what I hope to see, kind of more of a hope rather than a prediction, is I think that Arctic states and actors and engaged kind of leaders from outside the region also need to be working with Arctic, in an Arctic setting, kind of in a more modular way. Like what's something that 2 or 3 states or 2 or 3 Arctic actors can do that might show us the way forward in coping with emerging problems. So I think there's also a risk to waiting.
Where can those kinds of discussions take place? Are those for events like this, like the Arctic Frontiers, or do these take place like in the Arctic Council Secretariat or inside of the working groups or at some of these ministerial meetings? If we want to have these sort of reforms of the way things are working now, where should those discussions take place?
And I guess maybe Volker would probably be able to speak to that better than me, but what I was thinking was also more working with Arctic interests and Arctic knowledge in other settings, in global settings like the climate negotiations, working to kind of tamp down on marine litter, for example, would benefit the Arctic. And also like in the Nordic, as you know, you're from your perch in Sweden, that there's also some extensive cooperation in the Nordic regions. There's some interesting starting kind of Nordic-Canada cooperation in the security field, which I think is only in its very early days. So I think in like thinking about how to do things the Arctic way with what we've, and certainly not draining issues that can be addressed in the Arctic Council, but maybe also looking for all the myriad ways of moving forward on Arctic challenges from environment to security.
Can you make any comparisons on how this is done in other parts of the world? I mean, I know you've done some work in the Amazon rainforest. I mean, other regions that have like these ecological issues that need to be managed. Is there any other forms of cooperation there that the Arctic could learn from?
Well, that's interesting. And I don't know if there's something similar to IASC.
I think it's even the other way around. I would even think that many people are looking into what happened in the Arctic because the Arctic Council is kind of unique with its setting, with its structure, with the indigenous peoples part of the council and the decision making. I think this is a quite unique setting, and this is why the Arctic was always shown as a highlight, as a very specific and unique thing. And of course, those discussions that you mentioned, they would normally take place at the meetings of the senior Arctic officials, maybe not officially, but behind closed doors. And that is, of course, the challenge that the Arctic Council at the moment has, that they don't take place. So there are no meetings of the senior Arctic officials. I guess, I'm not sure, but I guess they still talk. Maybe the 7 at least, they talk, I would guess. And that's also the problem for the science that the Arctic Council is doing on working group level. Without the senior Arctic officials meetings and without the ministers meetings, there isn't the audience. That's the point. So the science is done, but who's looking at it? And that's, of course, the main challenge that the Arctic Council has. Though, as I said, Norway, I think, in the last 2 years did an amazing job in getting the Arctic Council up and running again.
I think also, I believe that the AMAP model was also AMAP assisted in setting up something similar in Antarctica, which is an interesting transfer that I know Rolf, one of our previous speakers, was involved in. And I think for me, I think there are certainly so many unique aspects about Arctic cooperation, yet at the same time, kind of like we've done in a project, we kind of looked at global meta, big ecosystems, large systems, and seen how are they governed. And what we see is kind of it's a kind of a growing repertoire that more and more states are setting up things that may, not on the level of formality necessarily of the Arctic Council, not at the depth of activity, but where they're engaging in sort of multi-issue, not just environmental cooperation, but also social issues, sometimes economic issues. And so when we looked globally, we found that about 40% of global meta ecosystems have some sort of regional level political framework of some kind, more or less strong. And I think for us the most interesting comparison was the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, kind of a really very kind of globally known and prized for many different reasons ecosystem. And I think some of the things that we noticed that were interesting about it is that when we studied them, both showed these sort of ordering effects. Like the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization was set up, or the treaty was signed and then the organization came later, but it was set up to kind of address what was seen by the states as a kind of a globalization of Amazon issues. They were concerned that kind of things were going to be steered from outside, largely informally, but kind of with real effects on their sovereignty over the ecosystem. And in the Arctic, we've also seen the same, that as Arctic cooperation consolidated, it really kind of entrenched and amplified the role of Arctic states while leaving space for other actors, for sure. So it does this broader ordering effect. And in some ways, it's not maybe it wasn't the purpose, but it's kind of an outcome that's produced. And in some ways, in these difficult times that we're now facing, it might be worth, for example, sharing, with the Trump administration, the fact that this is also good cooperation in the Arctic also is a way of demonstrating that the region is controlled, of demonstrating sovereignty, even if it's through cooperation with other Arctic states, kind of in the prospects of, the intense kind of US-China rivalry dynamic that we have today and will characterize things going forward. But I guess if I could kick off like a friendly competition between the Arctic and the Amazon, I would maybe think that, of course, the Amazon has not included the cooperation formally has not included indigenous voices in the way Arctic cooperation has both, and I think that's been incredibly important for not only in a rights or a justice perspective, but also in securing excellent outcomes from Arctic processes. However, what the Amazon states have done more effectively than Arctic states is that they kind of cooperate at the global level as a bloc. And sometimes they might be achieving outcomes we might think, oh, I wish the outcome was different, but they're using the global level to achieve their regional aims. And I think there's a lot of scope to do that in the Arctic for good outcomes for Arctic politics.
And how much knowledge exchange is there between the Arctic, and you mentioned the Antarctic, with the Antarctic Treaty System and SCAR and so forth. How much, I guess this will be something leading up to the International Polar Year in 7 years or so, but how much, as of right now, Germany, of course, is part of both. How much do we learn from the Antarctic that can be applied to the Arctic?
It's a completely different thing. So there's nothing you can transfer from one to the other. Look at the setting. The Antarctic is a continent which is kind of no man's land and protected by the Antarctic Treaty. So there are, of course, also economic interests, but they are all put aside as long as the Antarctic Treaty is there. So the governance structures are completely different. So there's nobody owns the Antarctic, and that's a very different thing in the Arctic. And there are no people in the Antarctic. That's the biggest difference, of course. So there's no, apart from a few scientists, or maybe quite a few scientists who work there over the year, but that's a completely different thing. And then, of course, the setting is that the Antarctic Treaty is a signed agreement. So it's a legally binding signed agreement, whereas the Arctic Council is just kind of a forum, you can call it. There's no legally binding thing behind the Arctic Council. So everything that the Arctic Council does is more like a recommendation for the member states. So, and then it's up to the state how to use it. In the Antarctic Treaty, everything is regulated and it's legally binding, so that's a very different thing. And that's probably also the reason why Russia is still participating in the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, because it's a legally binding agreement. And whereas the Arctic Council, it's just, a forum, or a mechanism for the states to work together. So it's not really comparable, it's a different animal. But of course, in the scientific world, there's very much cooperation between the North and the South, and especially within the International Polar Years. That's where it got started, actually. So if you take the last International Polar Year, 2007, 2008, that I think was really also a mechanism for the SCAR, so the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, and IASC, for the Arctic, to work closer together. So after the IPY, we signed an agreement with SCAR and formed a couple of joint bodies, actually, doing polar research. So there are not many scientists working on both poles, because it's logistically it's almost impossible. But still, there are so many common issues and common problems to address in the scientific community that this cooperation is very strong.
You've been through a few, you've been involved with the Arctic for quite some years now. You've been through a few different transitions between chairs of the Arctic Council. What do you see in this coming transition from Norway to Denmark? Do you see a certain continuity, or do you see some changes in direction coming up?
Yeah, firstly, looking back, I remember the transition when the last time the three Nordic countries chaired the council, because it's one after the other. It's Norway, Denmark, and then it's Sweden. And when this happened last time, that was really a change in the Arctic Council, because the three together developed a strategy for 6 years, and that also included the Arctic the Arctic Council's Secretariat, which I think made the Arctic Council much more professional and much more efficient and much more visible. And that was only possible because the three Nordic countries, they really joined forces and decided to develop the agenda for the Council for 6 years together. That didn't happen this time. I think possibly also, I don't know, it was related to the Russian invasion and the pause of the Council. I don't know the background, but they didn't do it. So, and the transition now from Norway to Denmark, or respectively Greenland, that's, I think, a very critical one. Because as far as I know, there's still not really entirely clear how this is going to work, if it's Greenland or if it's Denmark or Kingdom of Denmark. So, and then of course the other issue is we hear all the debate about Greenland in the news every day. So what does it mean for the Arctic Council? Yeah? Mm-hmm. So I think this is a really challenging thing for the Arctic Council to do this transition from Norway to Kingdom of Denmark or respectively Greenland. So I'm curious to see how that works.
Absolutely. And I'd just like to pull, establishing a secretariat is actually one of the criteria that helps organizations survive. So it's actually an extremely important moment to have that anchor point of agreement. And I think also the, having kind of made hay while the sun shone geopolitically, these, both the secretariat and also the binding agreements, I think, give this extra weight to Arctic governance. But I think, and I haven't seen, or I think the thing I've heard most about is this kind of relate within the Kingdom of Denmark, how will power be distributed, or who will sit in the chair and who will kind of lead the Arctic Council, and that's, as you talked about earlier, has been resolved. What sort of issues will be prioritized and how, I think, remains to be seen, and I think it will be extremely important and difficult to follow, given that really a lot of Arctic Council scientific outputs have been about how to understand the impacts of climate change across a range, on weather systems to biodiversity and so on. And we know that you also discussed in the earlier podcast that it was a very difficult moment in the Arctic Council with the first Trump administration and an unwillingness to sign a statement about the necessity of mitigating climate change was probably one of a big test for the Arctic Council. But then at the same time, it shows a bit of that resiliency. I think the Finnish chairship did an excellent job of just deciding, okay, we'll make some other kind of statement, and it's too politically damaging we don't wish to sign something that doesn't include this, and they won't sign something that includes it, so we'll have to work differently. And I think that we'll see also going forward more of that need to work differently, need to innovate. And in some ways, perhaps that the Arctic Council is a forum and therefore has this, it's not a treaty-based, it hasn't detailed what has to happen at each stage. There's kind of precedent and norms and past practices and so on, but I think it gives some flexibility in meeting these challenges.
And to go back to the Secretariat question, so before that, it was each chair country was responsible for setting up a Secretariat. And I remember the very first meetings that I attended under the Russian chairmanship at that time, so 2006, 7, something like that. And there was then one person responsible for Secretariat. And of course, this was pretty chaotic, I must say. And that's now, the Secretariat really professional and extremely well organized, including communication and everything. So it's a big change, I think. Yeah.
There's been quite a bit of institutionalization over the years. I remember at the end of the last time it was Norway, Denmark, Sweden. It sort of culminated with the ministerial in Kiruna, with all these new observers coming into the Arctic Council. Germany was an observer before then, but how has that changed the work of the observers, having so many more observers for the past 10 years or so? Is there coordination amongst you? And is there some desire to have more of a say in governance of the Arctic?
There is a communication between the observers. So there is something which is called the Warsaw format meeting, which takes place normally once a year. It's organized by Poland, and they invite all the observer states to a meeting. And of course, the observers discuss their position on the Arctic Council. I think they are all on the same page, agreeing that they are observers, and I think this is fine. But still, of course, being most efficient on the Arctic Council and getting your expertise in the Arctic Council is, of course, important for all of them. On the other hand, after that was 2013, when all these, I think many of the Asian countries were admitted, the Arctic Council became much more reluctant in approving new observers. So it's getting more and more difficult to become observer. I think for two reasons. First of all, the Arctic Council feels that too many observers are kind of diluting this whole thing. And then it also has very practical issues because the meetings are very often in remote places and you cannot host such a meeting with 300 people. So that means that over the last years they have been very reluctant with approving new observers. And there's a mechanism now since a couple of years already that observers have to, I think every 2 years, have to submit a report really outlining what they do in terms of supporting the Arctic Council, and also very important with the indigenous peoples. And that is reviewed actually, and then of course if you cannot document that they are doing something, they can kick you out actually. I'm not sure if that happened already, but it's possible.
I mean, how big for Germany, how big of a priority is it for Germany to be an observer in the Arctic Council? Is this something that the government does invest resources in to make sure that you maintain that spot, this sort of coveted spot as an observer to the Arctic Council?
No, we do a lot actually in terms of, it's also important for us because that's our way of getting our science into policy making. So I think it's not only being there, I think it's having something to say when it comes to Arctic policy. So then the way, of course, in the Arctic Council as observer is through the working groups, through science and expertise in the working groups. So myself, I'm German delegate for AMAP, for example, so I'm trying to get as much as possible from our knowledge into the AMAP system. So no, it's important. If you look at our new Arctic policy guidelines that were published just last year, they also state that the Arctic Council is important for Germany.
And it was interesting to see, for example, that South Korea, in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, has hosted, I believe, the first two, I think, or possibly 2 or 3, of the Conference of the Parties. That it's a very different setup than the Arctic Council in and of itself, but I think that it shows this kind of the dedication and importance of these also non-Arctic states in what is going to be an extremely important agreement for the Arctic Ocean.
Do you think the Arctic Council should take more of a role in these other peripheral agreements and bodies that relate to the Arctic? Or is it more on a national government level?
Well, I think most of the binding agreements, you often hear they're like search and rescue or oil spill prevention or preparedness and response, not prevention, as science and so on. They're kind of concluded. The science agreement is different, but the other were sort of concluded what they call sort of under the auspices of the Arctic Council. But those are really binding international agreements. So I think that and I'm not sure the extent, but at the same time, it's working group level knowledge that kind of is feeding essential information, like emergency preparedness and response is sort of the group that gave rise to the search and rescue agreement. And surely the work they do is keeping national level strategies ready to live up to their agreements. So I think that sort of knowledge providing in a changing environment is really going to be kind of a perpetual input, but not necessarily changing the agreements, but more informing what does it mean to live up to the content of those agreements.
Okay, well, I want to make sure we have some time for a few questions from the audience. So thank you very much for these really excellent answers. And we have time. Do you have a question here?
Yes, if I may.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. I'm Leif Lutzman. I'm a journalist from Denmark. And I can't bring you any answers to the attitude of where Denmark is putting its chairmanship, unfortunately. And I certainly miss a Danish voice on this discussion. I remember when 2 years ago at the Arctic Frontiers, when Norway were to take over chairmanship from Russia, they stated in a dispute with Americans that it was important for Norway to keep the Arctic Council as an A8 organization, including all 8 Arctic nations, whereas the Americans stated or quoted the Arctic Council as being a cooperational body between the 7 like-minded Arctic nations. Norway did a good job, as also Volker mentions, in uniting the 8 and keeping as long as possible and as much as possible keeping the 8 together. What's your expectations to the Danish chairmanship? Would you expect the Danish chairmanship to work for an even more united A8 or for a more polarized A7 plus 1? Do you have any clues on what's the...
You can only guess.
approach?
I can only guess. My guess is that Denmark will continue the Norwegian policy. Because my feeling is that all the 8 Arctic states really see the importance of the Arctic Council. I mean, it would have been so easy for Russia to say, okay, you don't want it anymore, we just leave it. But they didn't do it. And I think this is pretty obvious that all the 8 Arctic states, including Russia, they really need the Arctic Council. My concern in that context would be more what happens with the US participation in the Arctic Council, or seeing all the debates we have about Greenland. That may be even a bigger challenge for Denmark and Greenland with the Arctic Council. I would guess.
Yeah. Julie, and I'll just maybe to fill in there that I think, you know, certainly I do recall it was interesting to hear that kind of that announced from the stage in the plenary, the idea of cooperating with all 8 Arctic countries, which I recall from the other speakers didn't get immediate kind of support, although it wasn't really contradicted. And I do think there was, I haven't heard of it in the context of the idea of cooperating the Arctic Council as Arctic 7 states, but certainly it was a strong sense of there was some coordination going on. It was kind of what was seen as sort of a functioning stopgap measure while Russia had the chairship at the time. And I do agree with you, Volker. I do think that probably Denmark will follow Norwegian experiences and seeing how to continue coordinating. But again, just to mention that the main activity is in the working group, and the political level is interacting, but I think it would be a stretch to say they're cooperating as an 8, that it's more of a process of, kind of this protocol where they're able to kind of voice resistance if they don't like a decision or a request that's made and communicated by the chair. So, and of course we don't know how the situation, on the ground in Ukraine will change. I think we all hope it will end in a way that's on Ukraine's terms, but we also, know that sort of ending the war has been one of the stated aims of the Trump administration, and what will happen after that. And then I think the question is, it won't just be kind of like putting Humpty Dumpty, the broken egg, back together again. Like, things have changed, and the idea of being on a pause, it almost makes you think, oh, things aren't changing amongst the other Arctic states and in Russia. And I think that it'll be important and interesting to follow when cooperation resumes more fully. I don't think there were high levels of trust before. There was certainly more of a sense of like a narrative or a sense of collective identity that was animating Arctic cooperation, and I kind of doubt we'll see that again in the medium term.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed when you were speaking about treaties and the importance of treaties and how they're outside of the Arctic Council, and then you spoke about binding agreements, right? And so I'm interested in your thoughts on 2 things. The first one is that, is it your view that binding agreements like the Polar Code and the search and rescue, they're actually fueling greater risk-taking in the Arctic in terms of countries that want to get involved and enter the Arctic? So the Arctic Council is creating a set of guidelines that really fuel Arctic exploration and Arctic resource extraction. And my second question is about the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and how that is a really important treaty, and a lot of it relates to Arctic movement, and how the Arctic Council can be really careful not to, how the Arctic Council can participate in the existence of the convention to which the United States is not a signatory, but it is something that is applicable for the Arctic region. Thank you.
That's maybe more for you.
Oh, those are good big questions. Yeah, thank you for the question. And it is interesting, that point of, when we do kind of govern practices, it does also it does in some ways facilitate activities, even as it sets rules for those activities. And so, I see your point. At the same time, the opposite risk is just that those activities happen anyway without the rules guiding them. But I do think one of the things, to keep, I often try to remind myself that as the Arctic Ocean is changing and will be changing the next 30 years, so will the rest of the world. So sometimes when I see that very confident, like transpolar shipping route sort of drawn in a big purple swath across, possible at, I guess, what you went 2050 or something like that based on our predictions. I also think, oh gosh, I wonder what's their 25-year prediction about what will be global trade patterns when we have the climate change that will have transformed the Arctic Ocean will have also kind of increased sea level rise and drowned ports and changed patterns. So I think we often, like in that perception of thinking about Arctic change, we often, pause the other way. We forget that everything will be changing. So I think that makes kind of levels of activity very difficult to predict. But I guess it's just that in one principle that's really animated a lot of environmental governance more broadly is the precautionary principle, that you work ahead about how things could be used and think about how to prevent bad outcomes over activities that may come to be. And then I guess there is that risk that it might kind of bring the idea out to actors who may not have thought of it yet. But I think that the time lag between those two scenarios would be small. Interesting point, though. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I think so too, that these legally binding things like, of course, UNCLOS and the Polar Code, they are, of course, in my view, they're above the Arctic Council because they are legally binding things that everyone has to adhere to. So, and they become more and more important, in particular with as you said, with the sea ice disappearing. So there's lots of discussion. I get many questions from journalists about Arctic shipping. And I mean, the Northern Sea Route at the moment is not interesting anymore. Nobody uses it. There's only one Chinese shipping company that uses, and Russia, but nobody else would use it because you have to have a Russian icebreaker and pay for it. So, but I mean, once it's possible to go straight through the Arctic Ocean over the North Pole, that's another story. And then, of course, also these shipping, where can you do shipping, where is free shipping allowed? This is a legal thing, which is really important. And that's also, if you take a look at our German Arctic policy guidelines, you will see that there's very much emphasis on this shipping element and insisting on, let's say, these legally binding things and that people adhere to that. Yeah? So it's really important.
Okay, any more questions from the audience? Getting pretty late in the afternoon at this point, so well, thank you all for joining these 3 sessions as part of the future of the Arctic Council exploration that we did in 3 sessions. So thank you very much for Elana and for Volker, and thanks for joining us.